Has somebody started the webinar?
Not yet.
Should I go ahead and start it?
Yeah.
Well, it's 8.
Yes.
So you can. Yeah.
Okay.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to you for joining us at the inaugural policy dialogue organized by the UNESCO Memory of the World Program through the Preservation Subcommittee of the International Advisory Committee. I am Lai Pang, the chair of the Preservation Subcommittee and your host for this morning. This webinar on the digital preservation of digital heritage at risk is organized in partnership with the Information for All, Information Preservation Working Group, and associated with the celebration of the World Day for Audiovisual Heritage. The policy dialogue aims to provide a platform to discuss current priorities for the preservation of documentary heritage and identify key components of an international policy agenda for digital preservation that will inform the ongoing work of the Preservation Subcommittee to facilitate, support, legal framework, and effective application of digital preservation technologies and techniques. The dialogue will be conducted in 2 sessions to cater to an international audience across different time zones. There will be simultaneous translation of the sessions in English and French. This is the first session and will address questions about cultural identity and sustainability, while the second session in the evening will focus on technology and legal frameworks. We are pleased to share with you that over 1,000 participants have registered for the dialogue today. Thank you very much for your participation. Besides the Zoom session, the webinar is live streamed on UNESCO's YouTube channel, where the program will be recorded and will be available for viewing anytime. You can select the English or French YouTube channel as seen on the screen to participate in the dialogue. We have with us many prominent speakers from the memory institutions, academia, and the community to discuss and identify the policy issues and gaps in the digital preservation of documentary heritage at risk. The outcomes of the discussion will be presented in a report detailing key messages and policy recommendations, which will subsequently be fed into the second Memory of the World Global Policy Forum on disaster risk reduction and management for sustainable preservation of documentary heritage next year. I would now like to welcome the Deputy Director General Sinchi of UNESCO to deliver the opening remarks. Mr. Chi is the Ambassador of China to Belgium since 2014 and was appointed as Deputy Director General of the UNESCO in 2018. He will be speaking to us in both English and French.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to welcome you all to today's policy dialogue on the topic Documentary Heritage at Risk, Policy Gaps in Digital Preservation. Today's event is taking place online for reasons we know all too well. COVID-19 is affecting every aspect of our lives, not only our health, but also our education systems, cultural life, and social interactions. However, while the pandemic is rewriting our present, many useful ways of dealing with this unprecedented event can be found in the past, serving as our window into the world, which happens to be the theme of this year's World Day for Audiovisual Heritage, which falls today and coincides with this policy dialogue. Indeed, archives hold the answers to many questions in the contemporary world. They tell us about the social impact of the previous epidemics, including the influenza outbreak that killed up to 50 million people between 1918 and 1920, for example. They explain why historians and curators specializing in this field were among the first to raise the alarm about the danger of rumors and false information and to highlight the importance of transparency. As this shows, there is no history, no interrogations of the past by the present, without archives. Without archives, there is no memory, justice, or reconciliation. Protecting, conserving, cataloging, and disseminating these archives is therefore a moral duty, not only for today, but also for the future. Today's generations also have the inalienable right to access and use the records that document their past. This is where the Memory of the World program comes in. This program was launched to safeguard the documentary heritage of humanity by facilitating preservation, supporting universal accessibility, and enhancing public awareness of the significance of the records. One of the main ways it does this is by supporting policy measures that make it easier to protect and share assets held by archives, libraries, museums, educational bodies, and other memory institutions all over the world. Today's event aims to raise awareness of these efforts. It seems to address challenges to the long-term preservation of documentary heritage and the risks we run in losing access to it. It builds on the statement co-issued by UNESCO with a view to turning the threat of COVID-19 into an opportunity for greater support to documentary heritage. This statement highlighted several important issues that I would like to share with you to guide your discussions during this policy dialogue. First, it underlined the need for greater investment in the preservation of documentary heritage. This includes raising awareness about the relevance of memory institutions to the current crisis, a point that was echoed during UNESCO consultations on the impact of COVID-19 on African memory institutions. Participants spoke about the tremendous financial setbacks that archives, libraries, and museums have suffered, which have affected their capacity to serve the public. They also highlighted the importance of building robust emergency preparedness plans to be more resilient in the face of future crises. Second, the pandemic has shown the need for universal access to documentary heritage. In this respect, UNESCO has created a dedicated web page with resources for documentary heritage professionals, which showcases examples of how scientists, policymakers, and the wider public can learn from past pandemics, as well as how memory institutions themselves are tackling the crisis. As the pandemic continues, the documentary efforts undertaken by memory institutions will be crucial in helping future generations to understand the complexity and extent of this crisis, as well as to hold decision makers accountable. Third, it is critical that we implement appropriate policy interventions nationally and institutionally. Only in this way will we ensure that natural and man-made risks threatening our documentary heritage are effectively managed. A key aspect of this is digital preservation, which extends not only to analog documents, but also to born digital documentary heritage assets, which at the 2012 Vancouver Declaration on the Memory of the World in the Digital Age observes, are at risk of being permanently lost. Mesdames, Messieurs, sans l'adoption de nouvelles mesures efficaces.
Ladies and gentlemen, without adopting efficient measures, we are at risk of losing a great part of the world documentary heritage. This heritage, which is today at risk, is an invaluable memory to shape our societies in areas made fragile by wars and social problems, and in these that are most exposed to natural disasters. The lack of resources generally is yet another threat to the documentary heritage. These essential questions will be discussed during the virtual policy dialogue of today through four different topics which are closely related to documentary heritage: technological innovation, legal frameworks, cultural identity, and sustainability from the environmental, social, and economic standpoints. This discussion will contribute to the support to the implementation by member states of the UNESCO recommendation concerning the preservation of and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form. This recommendation dates back to 2015, and it is the main standard-setting instrument that should guide UNESCO's action in this area. However, we have to go further. We have to continue the discussion by building sustainable partnerships for a more efficient action in the longer term. Policy recommendations that will result from this dialogue will be presented at the second Global Policy Forum of the Memory of the World program, which should be held next year. This event will allow us to consolidate solidarity and international collective action to the benefit of documentary heritage. And this is really the objective of this virtual dialogue, the very first one organized by the Memory of the World's Preservation Subcommittee. UNESCO, therefore, reaffirms its support to the PERSIST initiative, which provides an action plan for cooperation between UNESCO and the International Council on Archives and the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. We have to redouble our efforts today so as to increase and support the sharing of this documentary heritage, which is an essential part of our common history. According to what Federico Meyer, former Director General of UNESCO, said, we have to remember the past, not to reopen old wounds, but to close them for good. Now, in this spirit, I would hope that you have fruitful discussions for a constructive and productive dialogue. And I would now like to invite Mr. David Fricker, who is the President of the International Council on Archives and one of the 4 vice chairmen of the International Advisory Committee of the Memory of the World Program, to take the floor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Deputy Director General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chi, for the thought-provoking remarks and your guidance for today's discussions. Next, I would like to invite Mr. David Fricker, President of the International Council on Archives, to deliver the keynote speech. David is no stranger to many of us working in the memory institutions and the digital preservation sector. He is a vice chair of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Advisory Committee and the Director General of the National Archives of Australia since 2012. In 2015, he was made Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters by the Republic of France. May I invite David to address us?
Thank you very much, IT, for that introduction. Thank you also to the Deputy Director General, Mr. Sinchi, and also to Mr. Faxen Vander, Chief of the Documentary Heritage Unit of UNESCO, for hosting this very important event. I'm addressing you now from Canberra in Australia. Canberra is built upon the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal First Nations, and I first pay my respects to their elders past and present. Nyaji Njimali, Ngambri Ngunnawal, Mujigang, Yanyibu, Jandu. In October 2003, UNESCO adopted the Charter on the Preservation of Digital Heritage. The Charter formalised the recognition by UNESCO that more and more of the world's cultural and educational resources are being produced, distributed and accessed in digital form, rather than on paper, film or other analogue formats. 12 years later, in 2015, UNESCO adopted the recommendation concerning the preservation and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form. Now, as the Deputy Director General has just reminded us, these two instruments are profoundly important because they articulate the value of digital documentary heritage, and they assign the Memory of the World program the responsibility to increase awareness and protection of that heritage and to provide for its universal and permanent accessibility. And this is the mission of the Memory of the World Preservation Subcommittee and its PERSIST project that emerged from the 2012 conference held in Vancouver. That conference was entitled The Memory of the World in the Digital Age. In this digital age, digital preservation of humanity's collective memory has never been more important. But the challenges of digital preservation cannot be underestimated, nor can memory institutions become too complacent. Across the world, there are a number of megatrends that, if ignored, could jeopardize the aspirations of the Charter and the recommendation. These megatrends include, firstly, the increasing spread of disinformation. To quote our colleague, Dr. Faxen Vander, we are seeing across the world an infodemic, where unreliable or false information is deliberately promulgated in order to manipulate public opinion and deny individuals access to authentic, authoritative, and unbiased information, in effect, to pervert public discourse and deny people their human rights. Another megatrend, we are seeing short technology cycles and rapid obsolescence of technology that could see culturally significant digital material lost before memory institutions have had the chance to complete selection and preservation. There's also a blurring of traditional and non-traditional institutions as keepers of documentary heritage. For example, where commercial businesses are being relied upon for long-term storage and access to significant heritage at a time where the legal frameworks in our rapid digital economy cannot keep pace with the principle of a universal right of access to information. We're also seeing the economic downturn as a result of COVID-19, which will leave many memory institutions underfunded at just the moment that we must be recording the international experience of the pandemic. And here I refer to the ICA's recently published statement, The Duty to Document. And I commend it to all of you to have a look at our ICA website and review that statement. The final megatrend I would mention is the impact of natural and man-made disasters. For example, as a result of climate change, where rising sea levels and severe weather events place a real risk on the preservation of unique heritage, or armed conflict which can lead to large-scale destruction of heritage or loss through looting and illicit trafficking. Against the background of these and other megatrends, this inaugural virtual policy dialogue will focus on 4 grand challenges that arise today for digital preservation, specifically to distill a set of priorities for digital preservation policy that will inform the ongoing work of the UNESCO Memory of the World Preservation Subcommittee. So, let me once again introduce those grand challenges for today. Firstly, how do we protect cultural identity that is at risk of loss? What policies are needed to identify those fragile or endangered cultures at risk of loss through climate change, geopolitical upsets, conflict, or other social developments? How can we use disaster risk reduction and management as a strategy for digital preservation? Secondly, how can we achieve sustainability of documentary heritage? This has never been an easy proposition. However, in the wake of a global pandemic and economic downturn, we are likely to see quite some reduction in the public funding and philanthropy that is directed towards memory institutions, drying up funding sources required for digital preservation. The recommendation calls upon member states to collaborate and cooperate, to join forces and share resources wherever possible. So, are there policy solutions around partnerships that can deliver new models of sustainability that do not depend on new sources of funding? The next challenge is technology, which encompasses risks arising from the obsolescence of technology that are relied upon to select, preserve, and maintain the accessibility of documentary heritage. Much of the heritage of the 20th century is held on magnetic tape, and now all formats are obsolete, and the material is in urgent need of digital preservation. This task is immense, and time is not on our side. The fourth grand challenge relates to legal frameworks, and here, can I say, we are in urgent need of national and international leadership. Technological advance is both rapid and relentless, and the structural changes in our digital economies will continue to see a proliferation of digital heritage accumulated in non-traditional ways. However, legislative change happens at a glacial pace. Effective policy development is required within international, national, and provincial jurisdictions to maintain the ability of memory institutions to select and preserve digital documentary heritage and to uphold the universal right to access cultural heritage. This inaugural Memory of the World virtual policy dialogue is a vitally important event. And in my capacity as the President of the ICA and a Vice Chair of the Memory of the World International Advisory Committee, I am delighted to see the participations of such eminent speakers brought together in this innovative international online format. So I look forward to the discussion ahead, and I will join you again with colleagues in the Lock Note session to summarise the key outcomes that will set the agenda for the Preservation Subcommittee as we face today's challenges for the safeguarding of humanity's documentary heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for outlining the mega trends and the 4 grand challenges confronting governments and digital preservation practitioners. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we now will start the first session of the policy dialogue, where we will address digital preservation questions relating to cultural identity. Each presentation will be followed by a short dialogue among stakeholders before opening up the discussion to questions from the audience. The moderator for the discussion is Ms. Shubha Chowdhury, Director of the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology in New Delhi, India. She has served as the Vice President of the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, the Executive Board of the International Council of Traditional Music, and consultant with the WIPO Creative Heritage Project and with UNESCO for the Cultural Mapping Project and Interactive Museums. May I invite Ms. Chowdhury to introduce the topic and the panel.
Sorry about that. Greetings, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce the first session of this dialogue of cultural identity at risk, and to introduce our first speaker of this morning, Rina Tiwari, who is Professor of Built Environment at Curtin University at Perth in Australia. She's really going to talk about a very, very innovative approach to the use of digital technology. So over to you, Rina. Thank you.
Thanks, Shubha, and good day from Australia to all listeners. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Noongar Whadjuk people, on whose land I sit and make this presentation. I thank the Mogamber survivors and their families, bringing them home WA, which represents the interests of the Stolen Generation survivors and my research team. As our keynote speaker remarked, issues around the risk of losing or misappropriation of cultural identity become all the more important. Number one, when we are dealing with intangible heritage. Number two, when that intangible heritage belongs to our First Nations people. And number three, when we are attempting to conserve it within a digital realm. Hence, this presentation raises questions of authenticity, ownership, and trespassing in the digital heritization of tangible and intangible cultural assets of the First Nations people. In the 1900s, Australian states enacted removal legislations, which meant that Aboriginal children as young as 3 and 5 years old were forcibly removed from their parents and placed in state or church-run institutions or missions. For the Stolen Generation survivors, that is, those children who survived the stay in these institutions, these missions are places of incarceration and reek with stories of loss, abuse, and trauma. However, for many of these survivors, these are still a homeland, the only home that they knew of as they were growing up. Although now abandoned, these mission sites carry a mix of memories, emotions, and experience. A project, Missions Connect, was directed by the views of the Stolen Generation survivors and their families. Aim was to create a virtual reality model of at-risk heritage sites that can serve as digital repository for storytelling and personal narratives, and which can document times, places, and individuals who are fading from current collective memory. So, what is Missions Connect? I will now play a short video to give a quick overview of Missions Connect.
Missions Connect is a virtual reality environment bringing the stories of stolen generation survivors to life in a powerful and immersive way. It's the result of a close partnership between Curtin's School for Design and the Built Environment and Bringing Them Home Western Australia, an Indigenous body representing the stolen generations. Missions Connect uses advanced spatial imaging technologies combined with extensive archival research, as well as talking with survivors to accurately recreate a mission site associated with the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families. Users can move around and through buildings and see details such as furniture, curtains and appliances of the period. The true impact of the platform, however, comes from hearing the voices of survivors as they recount their lived experiences. For users, the linking of stories with sight elevates Missions Connect to a powerful empathy, educational and truth-telling tool. For survivors, it's a space for connecting, healing and reconciliation. The platform can be experienced through immersive 3D screens, VR headsets, 360-degree desktop videos and on mobile devices. Potential Missions Connect users are the 1,000 organisations and businesses who have developed reconciliation action plans, as well as thousands of schools and dozens of universities.
So now that we know a little bit about Missions Connect, let us now discuss the first issue at hand. We know how important it is to recognize intangible cultural elements, stories and memories as heritage. However, there are some implications in doing so. If not done correctly, it could potentially lead to the distortion of these cultural elements. In order to minimize this risk and maintain an authentic, decolonized account, it is important to have a sustainable and inclusive planning, particularly in the production and management of heritage assets. In Missions Connect, the processes of producing these heritage environments were under Aboriginal control. There were 4 stages of production. First was mapping places. This was done through digital documentation, archival research, and most importantly, through the lived maps created by the survivors. Hearing people and connecting their stories and memories to the places where they occurred. The third was cataloging objects and placing them within the virtual reality reconstruction, thereby providing a context for them. And lastly, it was about tracing practices, that is tracing the routine and activities of survivors and embedding these within the virtual reality environment in the exact locations where they occurred. We used a strength-based approach to ensure complete involvement of survivors for the appropriate interpretation and conservation of these cultural assets. How do we now ensure that these cultural assets, when shared widely through the digital realm, are not misappropriated? We have attempted to avoid misappropriation since the physical and socio-cultural heritage, that is the tangible and intangible assets, are managed simultaneously within Missions Connect. Information about the physical assets are captured in these information poles, while the survivors' memories of the events are captured in these bubbles, the sound bubbles. The virtual reality environment is thus able to provide a context and hence reduces the risk of misappropriation. What the viewer gets is a decolonized perspective coming straight in the form of survivors' voices. It is important that such contextualized and decolonized digital heritage accounts be given due recognition in heritage registers. Questions around management and ownership of digitally preserved cultural heritage are critical. It is important for the Indigenous communities to retain the power to decide whether certain cultural practices or traditional knowledge can be shared or not. For example, in Missions Connect, it was the survivors who decided which aspect or which building was significant for them. They rated significance for each building, as can be seen in these bars here. Male dormitory, the one that survivors were keen to erase completely from their memories. It was here that, which was a place of abuse, basically. It was discussed, however, that with time, this could possibly change and that this building could find its place within the virtual reality environment in the future. There is thus a potential for a living heritage repository in the digital realm. This last point around trespassing on another's land or country is critical. In a physically located heritage site, you would probably avail permission and probably pay a fee to enter the site. How is access and entry fees managed in a digital realm? This could be managed through providing dynamic digital controls in a virtual environment. Say, for example, a paywall for individual viewers or a license for organizations like museums and galleries. However, it is worthwhile for the heritage policymakers to explore the role of digital trespass laws. I would like to end with a story. It was during the Mogamber reunion where we had an opportunity to showcase our work to survivors and families. And to our surprise and delight, we found that it was our little kids who were attracted to this technology. For them, it was a video game through which they could understand their history. Amongst others who tried, there was the 70-year-old elder whose feedback we can read here. Very spiritual connection. VR has brought tears for me on the past historical events that happened here and the souls that passed through this land. I will finish on this note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rina, for that very illuminating presentation. And as I said, a very innovative way for all of us to look at digital technology. I think a very important point is the importance of healing and reconciliation in what we see as preserving cultural identity. I'd now like to invite our speaker here, Tepaya Paringtai from the University of Canterbury at Christchurch in New Zealand, to share with us her reactions and take this dialogue further. Over to you, Tepaya.
Thank you, Shubha. Firstly, I'd really like to commend the work that your team has done, Rina, to support the healing processes for Aboriginal Australians. I was provoked by the presentation because I think you did touch on it, and this was in regards to the role of Indigenous data sovereignty. I'm just going to bring up my notes. So I think for policymakers and reviewers, that concept of Indigenous data sovereignty has a real role here. It's relatively a recent one, with the first major publication on the topic only appearing in 2016. But just to share, Indigenous data sovereignty is defined as the right of Indigenous peoples to own, control, access and possess data that derive from them and which pertain to their members, knowledge systems, customs or territories. It's supported by Indigenous peoples' inherent rights to self-determination and governance over their peoples, territories and resources, as affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's really important that we start to explore how Indigenous data sovereignty impacts digital heritage preservation, and from there explore what might that Indigenous data governance look like. I'd like to leave it there because I know I have a colleague that would also like to contribute some more dialogue. I'm not looking for an answer at this point in time, but I'd like to raise these notions for further development and thought leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tepaya. I think that's a very critical point, and I hope it will find a place in our policy documents as we summarize this dialogue. As time is short, I'd like to call upon our colleague here, Abdullah Al-Hinai from the Arab Federation for Libraries and Information from Oman, to share his views with us and his response to Rina's presentation.
Hello, good morning. You hear my voice?
Yes, yes, we can.
Oh, thank you, Shuba. The work of Professor Tiwari is an interesting introduction to the punctual virtual reality technology at our digital memory in chiefs in Oman. It can agriculture heritage at risk, but at the capacity for future generation to experience the built heritage, even though it's an solution. Perhaps it's could have wide application to authentically preserve oral history and intangible culture, to capture not only the voice of the past, but also the place that culture contacts. The Sultanate's offer to protect culture heritage. Since the 17th of the last century, the Sultanate has paid great attention to preserve culture heritage through the Ministry of the Heritage and Tourism, in light of the many dangers that culture heritage witness, such as trouble overlap in the Gulf region, geopolitics of borders and boundaries, climate change, natural disaster, urban expansion, individual behavior, stealing, tampering, not knowing its importance, oral history, and against people. The ministry has made great efforts and endeavors to ensure maximum protection of this culture heritage as follows: sustainable preservation of agriculture heritage, strengthening the museum sector, election of the Sultanate for 3 times as a member of the World Heritage Committee, the last of which is current 4 years, term 2019 until 2023. Participation in conference and meeting concerned with the protection of the culture heritage. Also, for example, Omani is working on using a virtual reality in its museum. They will use hologram technology and cinematography, especially in the Omani maritime history for the future generation. These are some points for the Sultanate's role preserving the documentary heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Rina, I wonder if you would like to respond to both these interventions from Tepaya and Abdullah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tepaya and Abdullah. Tepaya raised a very, very important point about the role of indigenous data sovereignty. When I look at the Missions Connect project, and when I look at the stories and the memories that the survivors shared, it is their IP, it is their individual IP, and how they want to share it, and who they want to share it, and how much access and control they want to give to the wider public. It has to be absolutely in their hands. And that is what we have tried doing. Also, it becomes important to have a very sustainable management system of this data. And that is where I say that when we are traversing in a digital realm in order to conserve their heritage, then it gives us the potential of using that as a living heritage repository. Because as people know, for example, just in this particular project, when it was shown to our Aboriginal community members, there were some people who said, oh, you know, my grandmother belonged to that particular mission site and was taken there, and therefore she would love to participate in this and contribute. So, you know, her voice was recorded, her stories and memories were recorded and so on. So it becomes a very sustainable living heritage repository. So I guess absolutely I agree with you, Tapaya, when we are talking about you know, how the heritage authorities or heritage registers can actually recognize some of these digital digital tools. Then it's very, very important that they see that the data sovereignty has been maintained. I completely agree with that. With regards to Abdullah's, you know, in terms of the wider application of this, I completely agree with that. We have tried out within Western Australia, but not just in Australia. We have had conversations with Canada, you know, Canadian residential schools. All the First Nations people, I think, would be very much interested in some of this work as well. So thank you for that, Abdullah.
Thank you very much.
Shuba, am I able to just make one final remark?
Absolutely, Dipaya. Yes.
Really quickly. So thank you very much for that reply, Rina. And I think we're on the same page. I'd just like to point out for those of us that are responsible for policy, given that most Indigenous data is not in the possession of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous data governance is seen as a key lever for addressing Indigenous data sovereignty. Under that governance model, it harnesses Indigenous peoples' values, rights and interests to guide decision making, which is exactly what has been talked about by Rina. What I'm suggesting is that we start to use these types of terms that are growing on in a global, globally accepted way. And if we're able to enact Indigenous governance, results in Indigenous control of Indigenous data through both internal Indigenous community data governance policies and practices and external stewardship of Indigenous data via mechanisms and frameworks that reflect Indigenous values, then we're more likely to not risk repeating past practices which, albeit unintentionally, may marginalise Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's really been a great session that we've got around Rina's very innovative work, looking at the Indigenous rights from Tepaya and seeing how Abdullah thinks these might be applied to the situation in Oman, dealing with ICH, Memory of the World, two conventions which are very closely linked. We'd like to now throw open the floor for questions for not a very long time, but for the next 10 minutes. So, Anna, if okay. Till we get any more questions, would you like to comment further on, I know that I've read your paper, we've seen the amount of work you've done with this virtual reality. Would you like to expand on some of this a little bit?
Yes, definitely, Shubha. We are talking about digital heritage here. And particularly in my case, I'm talking about conservation of heritage of our First Nations people. I would also like to highlight how important this is in order to educate our future generations, especially our Aboriginal kids, about what happened to their parents, to their grandparents, and so on, because there is so much of intergenerational trauma which these communities have, and it is really important for them to see the cause of that, the source of that trauma, And therefore, this particular thing about, becomes very important for our future generations. When we are talking about future generations, we are talking about technology, because our kids and grandkids are going to be excellent in technology, and they would love to, have something of this kind where they can actually play through the thing and learn about the history. So education is one component. I think it also becomes important as a cultural awareness tool for the non-Indigenous people. It is important for them to see what had happened, to them to know the true stories behind this. So I guess as a cultural awareness tool as well, it becomes important. Some of the other things, Shubha, as you mentioned, it is about healing and reconciliation. So, this Missions Connect kind of a tool could do so many things at the same time, I say. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can see how this has implications for so many of us dealing with decolonization now, talking about how we repatriate collections, how, it's just not moving material and ownership of the material, but the voice of the people to whom it belonged, whether they were colonized or whether they were part of a stolen generation. So I think this whole approach is an important thing in your work, but as well as this very cutting edge technology, which obviously always attracts the young. We can see how a younger generation would be so attracted by technology and be able to deal with it. And you rightly pointed out, it's just not for the people whose culture it is, but for others to get awareness. So there's the local and global implications of something like this. So thank you very much, all of you. Tepaya, is there any last comment you would like to give? Abdullah, we don't seem to have a lot of questions. So if there's any closing thoughts from either of our dialogue partners here?
I do have one. I'd like to pick on a comment made about the male dormitory in the video. And I thought that was really interesting. So there was a preference by Indigenous peoples to forget that part of their past. Yet your dialogue, Rina, was, oh, hold on, well, we might retain it because it might have future value. And I wonder, from who decides that we retain it? Is it the Indigenous people or not? I would like to add one final thought about, and I know it typically doesn't apply inside digital heritage, however, it might have a place, and that's the right to be forgotten. Because once it's captured digitally, we're expecting for that to have an enduring legacy. That might create unintended consequences for the people that we're trying to help. Thank you.
Thanks. Glad that you asked that, Tepaya. So with the male dormitory, the survivors said that they didn't want to have anything to do with it at that particular period of time, because they are still trying to confront their trauma, and they are at different stages of healing process, right? So we decided that no, we are not including the male dormitory within the virtual reality environment because the survivors don't want it. So we haven't included the virtual, that particular building. However, in the future, as the survivors, go through their healing journey, and they say that, yep, that's fine. We would want to, we are now in that position where we can actually talk about this, talk about our activities and the, some good memories of that, and leave behind the bad. Then there is an option in the future to include that. So as of now, no, we haven't included that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, sorry. There is a question that I would like to. There's a bunch. Suddenly we have some questions. So, was the VR technology a barrier for communities that were engaging. And linked to that, further question was, did Mission Connect employ any mechanism for reconciliating potentially conflicting interpretations over the historic event? That's something I think I was also very interested in knowing.
So the first point in terms of barrier, the technology barrier, when our survivors experience the virtual reality environment, either through the headsets or through the big cylindrical screen where they could immerse themselves, as a group, there was no problem at all. In fact, they were fascinated by the thing. And there were conversations that started happening where the survivors' memories were being triggered, and they would talk amongst themselves. Oh, do you remember this? Do you remember this? So it became a very, an environment which triggered discussions and triggered memories amongst the survivors. So that wasn't a challenge at all. In terms of the second point that was made about contrasting interpretations. So yes, when we read a number of documents, the mission sites and the government documents and the mission sites and the reason that the kids were, the Aboriginal kids were institutionalized, they are quite different reasons that they, that are given. However, this Missions Connect is about a decolonized view, about the survivors telling their stories, their interpretations. So I guess it is a view which actually contrasts the prevalent view, which is accounted in quite a lot of documents.
I think the question is, maybe I didn't put it right, were there conflicting views among the indigenous people when you're talking
amongst
about
the survivors themselves?
Among the survivors, were there conflicting views or different interpretations of something, and how would you reconcile that?
Yeah, so we have, survivors have had happy memories and very sad memories, right? So some of the survivors actually talk about quite good times that they had there. They just want to talk about that, but that is not the correct picture. So we made sure that, all the survivor stories, all the survivors who have participated in the project actually get their voice included. And you can actually pick up and identify the survivor, who you want to follow, who you want to listen, and so on. So you get different kinds of interpretations coming through.
Thank you very much. I think we just have about a minute. There's a question for Tepaya to say that what would be the best way to begin a discussion about Indigenous data sovereignty with communities, because archives in various parts of the world are probably not aware of the 2016 publication or don't know that they hold this data. I think maybe a long answer. Tepaya, if you can just guide the questioner to some online resource, that might be a good way.
I think the probably most current and most helpful website to go to is the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, IWGIA. And that is a global human rights organisation dedicated to promoting, protecting and defending Indigenous people's rights. And on there is some really good documentation about Indigenous data sovereignty. It makes reference to the CARE principles, which should work alongside the FAIR principles. And I'm assuming that most people know what those are with regards to data. If you don't, CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Governance is a framework designed to operate alongside the FAIR principles. The four core principles comprising of CARE is collective benefit. So data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from data. A is for authority to control. Indigenous peoples' rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognised, and their authority to control such data is empowered. R is responsibility. Those working, so people like us and memory institutions, working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how the data is used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. Accountability requires meaningful and openly available evidence of these efforts and the benefits accruing to Indigenous peoples. And finally, ethics. Indigenous peoples.
Sorry, I think we are, sorry to interrupt. I think we're hitting our time limit now.
Okay. But ethics, you know what ethics are.
Yes, ethics in very, very big letters. And I'm sure this will come up again through these 2 days. So thank you very much, Rina, Tepaya, and Abdullah for this session. I think we have many more thoughts about cultural identity at risk and how we might deal with them. So thank you again, and over to Lighty to bring this morning to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shubha and the panel for the insightful discussion. It leaves me now to go to the next item of the agenda, which is a short break of 5 minutes till 9:06 a.m. CET time or UTC +1. During the break, there will be a display of images of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Register and information about the program on the screen. Stay tuned for our next discussion on the topic of sustainability after the 5 minutes break. Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to session 1 of the UNESCO Policy Dialogue. We have come to the second topic of this session, where we will discuss the challenges and strategies for sustainable digital preservation of documentary heritage, particularly in the wake of a global pandemic and economic downturn. The moderator for this discussion is Mr. Robert Buckley, Technical Advisor of the National Archives of the UAE and the Chair of the Persist Policy Working Group. Robert is also a member of the Preservation Subcommittee of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Advisory Committee. I will now hand over to Robert to introduce the topic and the panel.
Thank you, Lei Chi. Welcome all to this session on sustainability. In this particular part of this session, we're going to have 2 presentations followed by 3 dialoguers giving their responses. And then if time permits, we'll have questions from the audience. It's my pleasure to welcome the first speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Vanderholben, who's the head of the Digital Preservation Department at the National Library of the Netherlands. Jeffrey?
Thank you very much, Robert, for this kind introduction. And I will start sharing my presentation. Greetings to all from the Netherlands. Thank you very much, UNESCO Organizing Committee, for this event, especially in this challenging period we're right into. In this short talk, I will outline how the National Library of the Netherlands approaches sustainability. Especially in this challenging world we're currently into, we think working together is more important than ever. We believe that a new paradigm is actually needed, in which a shift is made from the institutional thinking towards organizational networks. Let me briefly describe this in the next 10 minutes. As an early adopter, the National Library of the Netherlands recognized the potential of the digital revolution early on by starting large-scale digitization of books, magazines, and newspapers at the late 90s of the 20th century, and switching over to accept born digital publications from publishers already at the beginning of this century. As a result, millions of books, journals, newspapers are now digital and fully accessible for readers, students, and researchers via our online service Delver and in our reading rooms. Since 2002, the library has an operational long-term archive, which currently holds tens of millions of scientific articles and e-books from Dutch and international publishers. Currently, we are upgrading this archive towards a 3rd generation to become more scalable and robust for future growth and use. In international context, we also participated in the UNESCO Persist program and helped to define criteria for metadata of digital heritage. In general, the library holds around 7 million physical items and has around 500 people working. So what is sustainability? As we heard already from the previous speaker, sustainability is of course a technological challenge, but not only that. It's also about the way we think about our organization and even thinking beyond our organization. Actually, I would say we hope for the best, but we plan for the worst. I think that is the biggest message if you're talking about sustainability. We should think about capacity building, thinking how we should sustain knowledge and expertise on preservation for the long term. We should think about financial planning. Can my organization deal with digital preservation over the longer term? About risk management. What could happen in these years' time? And thinking even about a succession plan, because what if my organization fails? Can someone else take over? And finally, the governance of it. We need to draw up policies for preservation and get management commitments for the longer term. So that's simply said, but in the current situation, the challenges are quite big. The challenges to preserve this amount of digital heritage for the long term are bigger than ever before. While the volume and the diversity of digital collections have become immense and the infrastructure complex, they are also becoming the most prominent reflection, as we heard from David in the talk before. This is the reflection of the digital heritage in the modern world. An increasing amount of publications made today does not have a physical source anymore, such as websites, ebooks, and digital newspapers that have become the default. Losing this will create a digital black hole in our written history. The current economic downturn makes it even harder to accomplish. But there are also opportunities. We're not alone, as many organizations struggle with the same issues in preservation, and a lot of that has already been researched, developed, and is available for use. And it's not a world on our own. We should not forget that why it is so important. Focusing on preservation alone is not the big point. We should also focus on the reuse and making it accessible for future generations. And then, of course, preservation is an important topic for that. So how to accomplish that? Well, to succeed, we think a new paradigm is actually needed to make a shift from institutional thinking in silos towards organizational networks. A single organization is always limited to its own capabilities. But what could have been the potential if we combine our energy to cooperate to get an even higher result? The illustration on the left shows a way of organizing in which institutions take care of themselves, depicted as a circle. That is, we do it ourselves or we buy a solution for the problem. Often we also see the benefit of working together, resulting in some sort of a shared service with other partners. This is a traditional way of networks depicted in the middle. It works well for a specific task, but does not necessarily unlock the full potential of the whole network. And therefore, we aim for a network in which each partner contributes its part to jointly work towards a mutual result or an end goal. In this, we call this an organizational network, as defined and extensively described by researcher and author Patrick Kenis. All partners in such a network contribute to a common result, and each partner in the network shares knowledge and/or services of which all partners in the network can profit. In this way, different organizations can offer their specialties for other organizations. Together, the network solves the puzzle. Let me give you an example. I briefly mentioned the Dutch Digital Heritage Network. That's an organizational network of institutes in cultural heritage of the Netherlands. Almost 80 organizations and 5 domains, specific represented in notes, are taking part in this network. We're united by diversity because all organizations are really different, but with the same goal: to make our digital heritage sustainable, visible, and usable. We focus on collaborating by sharing services and knowledge. If the network is developed, managed, and maintained by the partners themselves, so there's no institute taking care of the network as a whole, and everyone can participate. We believe in the power of the network. We learned so far that to outbreak these silos and organizational limitations by working together cross-domain, and that smaller organizations can learn from large ones, and vice versa, as we did. To go beyond preservation by focusing on access and reuse now and in the future. And I hope that this network could be an example for other countries and regions. And that's why I'm bringing it up here. So if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, just go together. This is what I would like to speak about. If you want to learn more about this, please follow these references for future work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I appreciate your two taglines. First of all, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And the second, which I really enjoy, is that yes, you can go faster on your own, but you can go further and be sure of the direction when you work together. Those are both very good messages. For our next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Marcy Hopkins, who's the head of international at the British Library. And she's going to talk about partnership models and their role in sustainability, particularly the ones that have been pioneered and developed by the British Library. Marcy?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, Robert. Just going to share my screen. So thank you. My name is Marcy Hopkins and I'm the British Library's Head of International. I am not a digital preservation expert, but rather have an overview of the many different international engagements we do at the BL. We've just heard from Jeffrey about the array of digital preservation networks, some of which we are also engaged with. My short talk will focus a little bit more on the partnership and practice side, and I will spend the next 10 minutes introducing a number of our partnership projects to you and how they are set up. Just as a way of background, if you don't know us, this is the British Library. We are one of the national libraries of the UK and one of 6 legal deposit libraries in the United Kingdom. Like so many other libraries, we were closed during lockdown and have only partially reopened, but are happy to be receiving readers again into our reading rooms. We have a lot of things. We have 170 million items in our collection. And as a legal deposit library, we grow by around about 12 kilometers of shelving space every year. We also grow digitally, approximately 80 terabytes every year. And we hold 2 billion pages of UK web content. That is in addition to audio items, patents, and journal titles. We also host the UK Web Archive, the UK Sound Archive, and have 4 million maps and stamps. We're currently working under our Living Knowledge strategy, and this formulates 6 core purposes: custodianship, research, business, culture, learning, and international. And each purpose represents where we think we can engage more people with our work. The one purpose which in my role I'm mostly concerned with is our international purpose. We work with partners around the world to advance knowledge and mutual understanding. And under that, we have 3 main priorities for our international work: to increase engagements in those regions whose histories are reflected strongly in our collection, to take a professional leadership role in the National Library Network, and to support institutions whose collections are at risk from war and civil emergency. We do this work by participating in a multitude of partnerships and networks, research projects, and cultural programming. And I'm going to tell you about just a few of our projects now. This is our Endangered Archives program, short EAP. It's a program which is funded by Arcadia and which facilitates the digitization of archives around the world that are in danger of destruction, neglect, or physical deterioration. It does this by awarding a number of grants, each for equipment such as digitization equipment, archival boxing, dehumidifiers, laptops, but also training. All projects are carried out in the country where the archival material is held, and the equipment is left in the country so that new initiatives can follow on. There is a local archival partner who looks after the master digital surrogate, and they make it available locally. and the British Library has a copy of the material, and we also make it available online. So far, we have worked in more than 90 countries worldwide, including some incredibly remote and challenging places. Of management of statue copies, British Library. This person offers advice to recipients of grants and checks the quality of project outputs created by the projects. We've also published guidance on remote capture in really challenging locations, which is a guide that is freely available online and translated into various languages. The next project I wanted to tell you about is our partnership project with the Palestinian Museum. And this is a contact which came via the Endangered Archives program, who had spoken to the museum before. The Palestinian Museum approached us as they were building a new conservation and digitization studio and needed training and advice. Together with the Welfare Association in the UK, we sought funding through our Ministry of Culture, which runs the Cultural Protection Fund, an annual fund which supports cultural protection projects in 12 countries. We were successful, and the fund paid for studio equipment, which we gave advice on, and then funded a trip of two museum staff to spend 6 weeks at the British Library to learn about preservation, conservation, and digitization techniques. Our conservators then visited the museum a few months later to give further advice in situ. Through this project, the Palestinian Museum was able to digitize 3,000 of their 21,000 collection items at risk. And here you can see the museum conservator at one of our benches in our Center for Conservation, and our conservators then going out to Birzeit to visit the museum. Which is a new model for us, and we need to see how well this will work, because conservation skills are very difficult to train online. I've included a slide about our Qatar Foundation Partnership Project. Under this model, we digitize British Library collections with external funding from the Qatar Foundation and in collaboration with the Qatar National Library. This is a long-term partnership, currently in its second phase, with images of collections related to the Gulf and Arabic manuscripts digitized so far. We have around 60 staff who work on the collections, and they are embedded also with our existing curatorial departments to achieve a consistency of approach. All digitized content and expert articles are made available on a free-to-use web portal, both in English and Arabic. The thing to highlight here is the in-depth cataloging for this program, which is required, and which is the thing that really drives the discovery. It's incredibly time-consuming because it's difficult to automate. It's a manual process carried out by our curators and catalogers, page by page. Last year, we ran our first International Library Leaders Program, and this was the first time that we tried to package our own approaches, processes, and systems together to share with others. We did this because we get approached many times during the year by people who want to find out how we do things. And rather than just sharing our standards, we felt that people really benefited from meeting our staff, and our staff really benefited from meeting them to talk through ideas. So we designed a week which would give participants just that, talk about digitization, conservation, preservation processes, and workflows, but also about professional capabilities, leadership, and learning. Here in this slide, you can see a couple of sessions in action. A meeting with our Heritage Made Digital team. That was a workshop to consider best digitization approaches for different formats. And a session with our wonderful head of digital preservation, Maureen Pennock, and that was one of the most popular sessions last year. We are keeping in touch with this group and we'll be celebrating our first birthday together online in November 2020. So on my last slide, I thought I'd list some of the things we've learned, observations that are coming up time and again from different collaborations we've done at the British Library. It's the personal contact, the personal connections which build trust and understanding. It often takes time to build long-term partnerships. They thrive through long-term efforts on both sides, and that empowers people. Like I mentioned with our Palestinian museum partnership, new connections are made through established links, and in this instance, that came through EAP. We are opening up to new ways of working, especially now during the pandemic. Online meeting spaces can allow networks to meet more often and more easily. But there are also challenges. Many organizations are experiencing a reduction in funding, especially now, and that can affect their ability to participate in networks or even to employ staff to work on partnerships. Two organizations will often have differing strategic aims. There will never be 100% overlap, and they might come at a project for different reasons, some commercial and others to open up access to collections. So it can be difficult to find the right middle ground. Opportunities to meet face-to-face are diminished. We all want to be more sustainable and travel less. So how can we keep those personal connections and friendships alive? And then the last point about technology, which we've heard about already before. Digital infrastructures vary, making partnerships working harder in some places. We have a project which we had to put on hold long term as the partner has an unreliable internet connection and they cannot travel. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcy. You know, I think it's important, the messages we've heard both from Marcy and from Jeffrey. We all understand the role of technology and legal frameworks, for example, play in digital preservation, but there's also this institutional dimension. And beyond that, what we've heard also across institutions. So that's an important message, I think, as we go forward. I'm going to come back also to something you mentioned about the you having in your collection items that pertain to other cultures. That could go back to the first topic we discussed today. But before I do that, I would like to move now to the dialogue part of our discussion. We have three people lined up, three groups actually, to talk about the what we've heard and to give a viewpoint, an interesting perspective on sustainability in digital preservation. Our first dialoguer is Bunmi Aligbele from the Faculty of Education at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. He was also the former head of the Department of Library, Archives, and Information Studies there, and was a past president of the Africa section of IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. And he'll be the first person in our dialogue session. So Bunmi, let me pass it over to you now. I think we're having some technical difficulties reaching him. While we sort this out, let's move on to our second dialoguer. Leila, are you there?
Good morning.
Good morning. This is Professor Leila Hussein Mustafa. She's Professor of Library Administration at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She also teaches at the iSchool there. She's also a Middle East and North Africa subject specialist, and she's worked in human rights in both the Middle East and in the US. And she's going to talk to us about her perspective on sustainability. Leila?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting sessions, and I want to thank UNESCO for hosting this important dialogue and important work. Actually, I noticed that from my colleagues in National Library of Netherlands and the British Library that they both have almost the same issue, which is the challenge, which is I think everyone noticed. You are doing great job with the networks that you are building, with the collaboration between other organizations locally or internationally, which is we need more of this actually. The challenge that you are facing, I thought about, I have been doing actually a lot of readings about preserving cultural heritage for 8 years, and I published a lot about how we need to prepare to have a plan, not just a reaction. So now COVID-19 came and gave us another ton of things to think about it. But I think what the UNESCO is doing, something we need to take advantage of in a good way. UNESCO has offices around the world, okay? And they have expertise. My idea is, in order to come over some of the challenges, we need actually to create technology partnership. We are getting what the market is offering us. We are not trying to tell the market what we need. So we need kind of partnership. We don't need just to buy. We need to do internationalized standard of multi-language metadata, because most of the digitization is done by English. And then now we have digital humanities. They need to have access to this digitized materials, but they can't because the OCR, which is you work with when you do text mining or data mining, doesn't work with every language. We need to create also kind of database, like international database that have preservation toolkits, so we know what exists where, because we really don't know. So when I go and buy something, I might not know that Jeffrey has already have these tools, which is I can just consult with you before I buy it. So we need a toolkit. Preservation database includes skills. We need to know who has the skills and where and what language, because we don't have this database. So when I'm running, UNESCO is running training in Nicaragua, you don't have to bring someone from London, because we might have someone from Nicaragua who can provide this training, especially now with especially with COVID-19, we need to limit our traveling. So this is second. We need also to create database with digital preservations workshops. We do a lot of trainings, but we can also record it and exchange these trainings instead of keep trying from A to Z over and over and over. Funding resources, we need to have partnership, business models. The technology need us actually. Those people who are creating these tools, they need our ideas because we are the users. So they need to understand from us. So maybe we can partner with IBM, with Microsoft, with whatever in the market. We need also to organize more with the foundations, to have a database of foundations, who's giving money to who, and maybe we can also have, so we can find out also, like if the British Library is digitizing newspaper from India, the title is so and so, maybe I can say, oh, I have some issues, I can give it to you to complete your sets, instead of me digitizing 5 and you digitize 20. So we need to really have some kind of collaboration internationally. And honestly, I see UNESCO is the most organized, prepared for doing this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leila. Bunmi, I believe you're with us now?
Yes, I am.
Good.
Thank you. Yeah.
I introduced you before, but let me just say you're with the University of Ibadan. You were previously the head of the Department of Library Archives and Information Studies there, and you're past president of the Africa session of IFLA. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all. Let me start by thanking UNESCO for the organization of this conference, and of course, all the other people who have taken active part in ensuring this workshop goes on very well. I think it is interesting to listen to the presentations of our distinguished presenters. They've done a good job, and there are quite a number of things we can share from what they've said. But the presentations also highlight the hiatus or the gap that exists between the advanced countries and the less advanced countries. We observe certain differences, which I will quickly mention. The first one, of course, is the fact that, of course, one would have to recognize that the status, the level of development in many African countries is not even. Some countries are doing very well in the preservation of digital preservation. Some are not doing too well. I can mention, for example, South Africa, Senegal, and Kenya, and some other countries which are doing very well, but some are not. And but basically, I think let's just mention a few of the challenges we seem to observe. The first one is the absence of a national policy, and it's indeed very appropriate that this conference is talking about policy making, how to ensure that there is a policy on digital preservation. In spite of the charters of UNESCO, it doesn't appear as if this has simmered down properly in developing countries, particularly in Africa. This government support. The efforts we've made in Nigeria, for example, have not yielded much fruit because our government has not come up to actually support the efforts that have been put together. And so we have lack of or inadequate government support, which of course leads to poor funding. If you don't support, then naturally you're not likely to provide the funding that's necessary. And so we have poor funding to operate on a residuous budget. The budget is poor, you cannot do much, particularly more seriously at this time of COVID-19, when most of the funding is cut. Of course, we would also talk about inadequate skilled manpower. Digitization, preservation, all need skilled manpower, which we lack most in many African countries. And so we have a big problem there. Then there's poor infrastructure. I guess when I listened to Jeffrey Vanderholben, the speaker who talked about the complexity of infrastructure. The problem in African countries is not the complexity, but the poor infrastructure. Infrastructure is not there at all, or is not adequate. And so we begin to look at the course, we also talk about the poor access to reliable, high quality bandwidth, which of course affects most of these African countries. Now, but when you look at the presentations, I think there are some takeaways from the good presentations that have been given. I was particularly happy with the presentation where the networks, organizational networks is mentioned. I think it's a good takeaway. We'll look at it. I think African countries, developing countries should look at that as coming from a highly developed country, something that can be tried out and see how successful it will be. I want to thank Mercy Hopkins, from BL, regarding endangered archives. that has affected a lot of us positively, particularly in African countries. My country, for example, has benefited tremendously from the intervention regarding endangered, what they've done with regarding endangered archives in Africa. I think we expect that they will expand this in the future because of what the BL is doing, technical expertise in the area of digital preservation. And therefore, any help that can come to these countries will be very, very appreciated. That's in line with that. I want to thank I think we hear about the International Library Leadership Program, which is, if we can have more countries do that, much welcome, because it's a way to benefit from the expertise that we have in all these other countries. We want more countries to take a cue from what the BL is doing. I know some countries are doing this and they're not advertising it, but we want more to be done so that more people can benefit. And so we can, see more progress made in the area of the preservation of materials, archives, and records that are endangered. Well, on that note, I want to thank the organizers again and hope that this will be one way of ensuring that we're linked up properly with what is happening in the developing countries, and we can benefit maximally from this. Thank you, UNESCO, for what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bunmi. Your comments have already elicited an enthusiastic response from the
Thank you, Dr. Buckley.
They've said that's a great issue. Listen, we have one dialogue left to hear, so I want to introduce our next speakers. Actually, it's a team. It's Team Henri from the National Archives of the Republic of Indonesia. You can see them on the screen there. It's Mr. Adi Gesit Panbubi, who is the head of the International Cooperation Team, Mr. Danny Sugiharto, who's the head of the repository team, and Mr. Precietto Utomo, who is an IT specialist. Gentlemen?
Yeah, Robert, can you hear me? Hello?
Hello? I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I would like to say hello also to Marcy, Jeffrey, and Laila, and Mr. Bunmi. And yeah, hi. Yeah, it's interesting discussion, and especially for Jeffrey with the project of Delpar PUNNL. Yes, I quite follow the program during that time. It was called kranten.kb.nl, I think. So it's quite a huge amount of digital materials. It's also quite have a connection with my country, Indonesia. So we have also a lot of Indonesian newspaper there. Okay, then. Well, in a discussion, yeah, we could not agree more with the presenters from UK and Netherlands, Marcy and Jeffrey, who emphasized on that the collaboration is an important issue to ensure the sustainability of digital preservation by memory institutions. And I would like to raise some perspective from Asia, especially from Indonesia, because it's also during this pandemic COVID-19, it's greatly impacted on the government policy in many sectors, including the cultural sector that affects sustainability of documentary heritage preservation and management, including in Indonesia. Yeah, unlike in other countries, our country is an archipelago with 17,508 islands in a total area of 1,19,000 kilometers square, and inhabited by approximately 265 million people. and it made up from more than 300 different ethnic groups. So which certainly make a different challenge on the digital preservation effort. So National Archive of Indonesia is a state agency that preserve the archival documentary heritage. We hold 30 kilometers of textual archives, 3.4 million sheets of photographs, and also many more in films, videos, sound recording, and other materials. So our collection spreads from 1902 until nowadays, and the oldest collection is the Dutch East India Company. So it's not probably it's not too unfamiliar for Jeffrey. The VOC archives, and the latter follow it is the Dutch colonial government, British Regnum, Japanese occupation, and the Republic of Indonesia. Furthermore, the information about our institution and the effort on digital preservation in Indonesia, my friend Danny will tell more about it.
Okay, thank you for information about digital preservation. An important milestone in the digital preservation in Indonesia occurred in 2016 when the National Archives of the Republic of Indonesia create a digital repository, so we call IDEPOT, to preserve the digital archive material. This depository shall become the center digital archives of the country that emphasize long-term digital preservation for the current and future generation. The collaboration aspect also becomes a vital part in digital preservation strategy of National Archives of the Republic of Indonesia. The implementation of e-government program by the central government enable National Archives of the Republic of Indonesia conduct every effort to ensure the sustainability of its digital preservation program together with the related institutions like Ministry of Administrative and Bureaucratic Reform and other institutions like Ministry of Communication and Information, Ministry of Education and Culture, and National Library of the Republic of Indonesia, and etc. We also developed the Indonesian Archival Information Network, also like Jeffrey in presentation. It is a portal that could be used by the public to access for the archives that are kept by archival institution in Indonesia. This portal managed by the Center of National Archival System and Information Network and use ICA Atom software. So this portal connected with the government agencies, regional and municipal archives, and some universities in Indonesia. National Archive of the Republic of Indonesia also collaborate with partners from abroad. In 2011, National Archive of Republic Indonesia have a cooperation with the Courts Foundation as a non-governmental organization from Netherlands. Maybe Jeffrey know about it. Conducted a program to increase the access to VOC archives in Indonesia. So the activities include digital preservation and online access of the archives. The main result is a portal, namely sejarah-nusantara.andri.go.id, in which public could access the VOC archives via the internet. So my colleague Pras will continue.
Okay, thank you. National Archive of the Republic of Indonesia also actively developed its human resource by sending its employees to participate in training on digital preservation abroad that conducted via the collaboration with our country partners or international organizations. Nonetheless, any collaboration shall be worthless if the institution didn't have a strong policy that impact on the financial support, then focus on the digital preservation. effort. The year 2021 shall become the momentum of National Archive of the Republic Indonesia with the support of the state to increase the capacity and sustainability of digital preservation after the pandemic. The focus of the development record management software, increasing of digital repository capacity, and acceleration on archive digitization become the priority of the institution to ensure the preservation and access on archival documentary heritage for public. To conclude our response, the collaboration between memory institutions and the related domestic and international stakeholders is absolutely substantial for the sustainability of digital preservation program. Other aspect will be policy of the state itself that should reflect the concern on the preservation of documentary heritage in the country. Nonetheless, memory institutions shall encounter a full support in the effort to preserve the collective memory of the nation. The memory institution also should not only invest on the program, infrastructure, and facility, but also in the capacity building for its staffs, because they are the assets that shall determine the success of digital preservation program. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Robert, back to you. I think that's our response.
Thank you, Team Henry. You know, one thing I think I've heard from all of the speakers and the dialoguers is it's not just about the institution, but it's also about the dependencies beyond it, the opportunities in working with other institutions, and the value that can be achieved through those kinds of collaborations and partnerships and networks. So that's an important message. Our time is up. I have a couple of questions from the audience. Lei T, shall I wrap it up or hand it over to you, or can I ask a question or two?
A question or two shortly, that will be good.
I may have one then? Okay. I have a question here. Let me, it was directed for Jeffrey, and it's about through the organizational network, have they developed some kind of a repository, an organizational repository, or are each institutions on their own for that?
Well, thank you, Robert. Very good question. There's not such one repository, although that could be, of course, a decision if you work in a network that you can join together and make one shared service. But it's not a mandatory aspect. So that's actually up to the partners in such a network. Although I could say that it's not only about, of course, the infrastructure that is needed, but still it is also, I think, about having ambassadors or coaches in a network that can talk with the different partners and describe what the needs are so that they can be communicated among the partners in a network. So yeah, that could be a solution, but it's only a technical solution, I think. It's more also about having a dialogue with all the partners in the network.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And Marcia, one quick question for you. It's a very straightforward question about getting copies of items from your collection that may to apply to a different country or different culture. Maybe things that come up through the, say, the Endangered Archives program. What can you say about that if people want to get their get copies of material that you have?
So most of the things we digitize are freely available on our websites. So you can have a look at our different viewers on our websites using our catalog or through the EAP website. If there's anything on there which you cannot find, you can always get in touch with the British Library Imaging Services or the International Office. We get many of these requests every year, and just ask for specifically what you're interested in, and we would be back in touch with you, helping you to find items you're interested in.
Great, thank you. We run over. With that, I'm going to close off this discussion. I want to thank all our speakers and our dialoguers. We could go on, but at this point, I'm going to have to turn it back over to Lei T. Lei T?
Thank you, Robert, and all the panel for an engaging discussion. We have heard in the opening remarks by the Director General of UNESCO, Sinchi, the importance of archives and memory institutions in a crisis like the COVID pandemic. Without the preservation of documentary heritage, there will be no history and interrogation of the past by the present, and by that extension, the present by the future. So preservation is all the more important in a pandemic and in a crisis situation. Our keynote speaker, Mr. David Fricker, has outlined 4 grand challenges in the digital preservation of documentary heritage. We have heard 2 of the 4 grand challenges confronting governments, memory institutions, and the community, and the need for building an international policy agenda to address the issues and gaps identified. Under cultural identity, work is needed towards a framework and guidelines for assessing the significance of documentary heritage and the suitability and effectiveness of practices and methods for long-term preservation. And of course, the sensitivities involving the access of digitized or digital cultural heritage, including cultural identity at risk. Governments can use the framework and guidelines to identify strategies, evaluate proposals, and plan funding for the preservation of national heritage. The discussion also highlighted the need to develop policies and strategies to address appropriate digital preservation measures to prevent or mitigate the effects of destruction of our documentary and other cultural heritage. Under sustainability, there's a need for an international and also perhaps national and institutional policies supporting economic sustainability, and for some, infrastructure for long-term digital preservation initiatives. And we have heard from the speakers and the panel that it is important for policies to encourage the formation of networks and partnerships among preservation practitioners and across institutions. And of course, the value of cultural capital as part of the national economy. This work is tremendous, but very significant, and the Preservation Subcommittee will not be able to do it alone, nor do we have all the expertise required to address all the gaps. We hope that Session 1 has provided a platform for policymakers and the industry to hear the voices of the practitioners, and for initiating dialogues between policymakers and practitioners, and between the industry and practitioners. As the chair of the Preservation Subcommittee, I would like to thank everyone in the panel, the UNESCO Documentary Heritage Unit, and you, the audience, for your attention and engagement in the dialogue. We welcome your feedback, and we will be engaging you through seminars, task force, work groups, and activities that we will publicize on the UNESCO Persist website. The dialogue is not over. Session 2 of the policy dialogue will start at 1700 hours CET time or UTC+1 in the evening. It will discuss technology and legal frameworks to support sustainable digital preservation. At the end of the topic discussions, there will be a lock note session, which will be the highlight of this event. The lock note discussion will invite representatives from UNESCO and the community to summarize the key outcomes of today's discussions, which will then set the agenda for the Preservation Subcommittee in the area of digital preservation. Participants can use the same Zoom registration link for the second session. I would also like to share with you the YouTube link for the policy dialogue, where you can view the recordings of all the sessions online anytime. Thank you, and see you later in the evening.